Hi.
Hi, Pascal. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm better than the euro. How was that as a transition? Uh-huh.
That's a pretty low bar.
Yeah, sure. Why not? You are in Paris. I am in Washington D.C.
Yeah.
The two greatest capitals in the world, except for Washington D.C.
By far.
Have you actually been to D.C.?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Once.
terrible. It's a terrible city. Anyways, as a Parisian, you were sitting on the ground zero of the Euro ongoing crisis negotiations, Germans versus Greeks.
Yep.
Parisians versus everybody, I would hope. What the hell is going on? All we see I get the New York Times delivered to my house every day, and there are two headlines that you can count on every week. On Tuesday, it is that everyone urges the Germans to do something about the Euro crisis, and on Friday it's like huge new Euro agreement reached, and then you wait about 10 days, and then everybody urges Germany to do something about the Euro crisis. What's going on? Where are we in the cycle? Is everybody howling and raging in the streets? Give us some assessments of what the hell is happening.
So everybody is howling in the streets in rage, at least in Greece. So the latest episode in the saga is that the EU, the ECB, so the central bank, and the IMF have worked out yet another deal that will allow Greece to pay its debt, to pay some of it. It has a big payment due March 2nd, I believe, early March anyway. And so that deal is supposed to provide the money to pay at least for that payment. And obviously the deal comes with some pretty stiff guarantees from the Greek government, and they've approved it. Now in theory, we should be safe at least till the end of the month because the Greek government has approved it, and the deal comes with naturally lots of demands on austerity, with like cutting government spending, raising taxes. The minimum wage is going down by something like 20%. I mean, something huge.
And this is for everybody, not just government workers.
Excuse me?
This is for everybody and not just government workers.
Yeah, the minimum wage.
Right.
So, yeah. I don't know if the implication is that if you had a minimum wage job, you get a 30% pay cut, or if it's just for new jobs. But still, symbolically at least, you understand why people are in the streets, even if you, you can make all the economic cases you want about how minimum wage isn't great economically. If you say, we're going to cut it 30%, people are going to be in the streets.
Sure, and
one
especially
of the provisions.
No, go ahead.
Excuse me?
Go ahead.
One of the provisions in the bailout that, sort of gets the Greeks particularly angry, and understandably so, is that it provides for quote-unquote permanent presence of this sort of the so-called troika who's enforcing the deal. So there's going to be a team of people who are going to be permanently present in Athens and who are sort of going. I'm not sure if it's literally going to be the case, but the idea is basically that they get to approve every single thing that the Greek government does. So the deal virtually provides for the occupation and massive impoverishment of Greece, and so the Greeks are not happy, surprisingly. So that's the latest round in the saga.
And the troika is Germany, France, and somebody else?
The troika is a combination of the EU, which means in practice Germany and France, the ECB, and the IMF.
Before we chew on various bits of that, can you give us an assessment or sort of snapshot of where public opinion is about this stuff in France, which is kind of an interesting linchpin. I mean, we all know that the Germans and the Greeks hate each other's guts, and Germans have a very strong sense of keeping value of the currency and being the kind of biggest tightwads on the continent for a variety of historical and cultural reasons. French are more inclined. They will have a strike. They will burn a sheep in the highway if anyone sneezes too loud. So there would be some natural cultural affinity, but the French don't love Greeks at all and don't necessarily think that they ever merited joining the EU in the first place. So can you give us a snapshot of where the Parisian street is at?
Yeah. France is in an interesting position in all of this because it's sort of like depending on the time of day and whether it's sunny out or whether it's raining and which way the wind is blowing, France either looks like Germany, meaning one of the core European countries with a strong economy, blah blah blah, who gets to run the show, and then the next day it looks like, well, if not Greece, then at least Italy, meaning a country whose debt is about to go in flames and who's going to be one of the countries that's going to need a bailout, which, I mean, it's never looked like that way precisely, but sometimes it looks like it might happen. There were some scares about the French debt a few months back now. And so it's in an interesting position where we're like, nobody wants to bail out the other guy, but at the same time, we might be the guys who need a bailout 6 months from now, so we're not going to be so strongly anti-bailout. There's a bit of that going on, I think, in the back of the minds of most people. So the public opinion isn't so much anti-bailout in the sense that there are no protests, there are no strikes about what's going on in Greece. I mean, the idea of bailouts is never popular anyway, at least in theory. But there's no broad revolt. It's more like grim resignation. It's kind of British in a way, which is strange for France, right?
Unless you're in Normandy, obviously. It is interesting to note or watch how America talks about this ongoing thing, or I should say, how America does not really talk about this. And I follow, probably to a very unhealthy degree, presidential politics, particularly on the Republican side. And Republicans have been kind of, cheap euro bashers for a long time, not necessarily just the currency, but the concept. I was at the 2004 Republican National Convention in New York, which was a festival of awfulness in every way, and the great accusation against John Kerry or against the Democrats there is that they're outsourcing foreign policy to Paris and this kind of stuff. With all of that, and with Greece and the euro is in serious existential crisis and fiscal crisis, really hasn't come up. It just hasn't come up. The way that I think we've had 20 debates now, Republican debates. I am not sure there's yet been a single question like, what does the euro crisis that's happening right now, or what impact does that have on U.S. foreign policy? How does that, or just U.S. policy, how does that shape the way you think about stuff? Or what do you worry about? That has not been a question. It comes up only in passing, usually when someone like Ron Paul or occasionally Rick Santorum will say, "Hey, look, we're Greece, except that we're a reserve currency." Which I think it's a bit of an exaggeration, but only a little bit. America debt to GDP is already zoomed past the 100% threshold, and you and I both remember a time when 60% was considered bad, and I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there were these rules in Euro. You couldn't theoretically be a member of the Euro compact without having your debt below a certain level as a ratio of GDP, and obviously the FIGS countries, and probably by now France.
In theory, but it was never applied.
It was a theory that was never done up. So it's this bizarre thing where it is in many ways outside of the Arab Spring, it is the biggest world story, and we're not talking about it in the United States too much. I mean, the way I would look at it is that there's a success curse. There's a lot of people in kind of my with my ideological tendency who have always hated sort of European integration, and especially the euro, for reasons that are kind of understandable, and now look a little bit prescient, which is to say there's a democracy deficit in the whole exercise. I mean, it's technocrats getting together, and that is ultimately, as you alluded to earlier, that is why people are in the streets in Greece. Yeah, they don't want to get their cushy, not saying that cushy, but they don't want to get their benefits and money cut. But this is being imposed from the outside, and that's tough to swallow for any nation state, for crying out loud. I've always been enthusiastic about the euro. My wife is French. I own euros, and I like the process of European integration.
You must be proud.
Yeah. Well, thank God.
I remember joking to my American friends, like, this is a euro, it's like 500 of your dollars, and now I don't make that joke.
Well, a great untold story, I think, is that the euro actually has exceeded every single
it held up pretty well.
Yeah, and it still does. I mean, I don't know what it's trading at right now, but I have made money over the years trading dollars for euros.
Thing began, but it's held up remarkably well. Yeah.
But I think that speaks to something that ultimately is even a more dangerous bubble, which is to say, when there's nowhere else to go, what do you do with money, right? You have the U.S. dollar, which has a ton of problems, a ton of structural problems that are similar to the euro, or you have the euro, or you have what? There's not really a big choice out there, and so there's kind of a success curse. It's like a resource curse that a lot of oil-rich states have. You can get away with being crappy if you are the euro or if you are the U.S. dollar, and that, I think, indulges ever worse behavior because you don't really have to pay the piper at the end. And I think in Europe, then that creates, I mean, the integration problems and the democracy deficit problems are more profound ultimately, I think, than in the U.S. But in the U.S., that I think that we can get away with misbehaving or not keeping a basic fiscal house in order, basic fiscal sanity for a long time, and until the moment that we can't, and then that's going to be a really super awkward day, I think, for all of us.
Right. So regarding the euro, there's a number of things at play. One of them is just the simple fact that the EU is the largest economic unit in the world, right? It generates more GDP per year than the U.S. And so, even if some countries in the Eurozone stop growing, you're still talking about an enormous economic area, so people are still going to invest in. Like, if something huge shrinks by 2%, that's not good, but it's still going to be something huge. That's one reason. The other reason is that, and I would argue the big reason, is that the European Central Bank has been, in my view, criminally, has been wedded to the idea of a strong euro. And so it has, out of the large central banks since the start of the crisis, it has had the least accommodating policy, and it's stringently refused to any, not just bailouts, but any sort of accommodating position beyond low interest rates, which aren't really that low compared to, say, Japan, the US, the UK, sort of comparable sort of big industrialist countries that are in recession or near recession right now. So this really strong signal by the ECB, especially under Trichet, now things are slightly better, that no, damn it, we don't care if millions are going to be unemployed, the euro is still going to be strong. Well, that leads to a strong euro. And so that's, to me, that's the main explanation as to why the euro has stayed relatively strong, especially if you compare it to the policies of the other central banks, because currencies are never strong intrinsically; they're only strong relative to other currencies. So if everybody else is sort of being very accommodating and printing lots of money, and somebody else is printing less, well, their currency is going to go up. So
is there a lot of sorry to interrupt, but what the hell? Is there a lot of how do we get ourselves out of this sort of discussion? Are people wargaming or mapping out a future, which to me seems like a pretty obvious place where we're not talking about the Greek crisis, we're talking about the drachma crisis again?
Right.
Is there disintegration on the table, or is that right now such a terribly unthinkable thing that people don't dare out in public?
I think it's in the unthinkable zone. The problem is that in this current crisis, everything but muddling through is quote-unquote unthinkable. Because, the basic reason for the crisis is that you had a currency zone that was completely suboptimal with people who have vastly differing productivities, and the Greeks on one hand and the Germans on the other, and everybody else on a spectrum along those lines. And you can have a currency area with vastly different pockets of productivity if there are massive fiscal transfers from the more productive regions to the less productive regions. So people in New York City and the Bay Area and Los Angeles pay for the people in Mississippi to be able to lead relatively normal lives and not get crushed by the fact that the dollar doesn't work for them, except that because the U.S. has an identity as a single country, people don't see it as California bailing out Mississippi. They see it as America being America. And so you have this situation where either you break up the euro or kick some countries out of the euro, but the problem is that if you kick Greece out, then you have to kick out Portugal, and if you kick out Portugal, then you have to kick out Spain, and if you kick out Spain, you have to kick out Italy, and if you kick out Italy, then there's no euro anymore. So either some form of breakup of the euro or a federalizing of Europe, meaning huge fiscal transfers forever from the richer areas to the poorer areas, which runs into two problems. Number one is, well, one problem really, which is that people don't want that. That's the basic thing. People in Europe don't feel or think of themselves as Europeans first, and they don't want to be in a single sovereign European state with a single budget. And so if you were to federalize Europe, you can either have a federal Europe or a democratic Europe, but you can't have both. And so if you federalize Europe, that means that you basically give up on the idea of democracy in Europe. So those are the options.
That's very pleasant sounding. How old are you? Do you mind me if I ask?
Sure, I'm 25.
You're 25, right. So you only know, for the most part, a pretty heavily sort of integrated and unified Europe. which is bizarre. I'm 43,
Yeah.
and lived in Eastern Europe for most of the 1990s, and so I kind of watched certainly how the East began to integrate back into the West, and then the West was busy doing all kinds of very interesting things in the 90s. So people, let's say in August of 1990, could not have really imagined they couldn't have really imagined monetary integration to the extent they could have imagined the Schengen Agreement and, Polish people being able to work in British restaurants and that kind of stuff, or your Polish plumbers in Paris, which you guys all hate, all that kind of thing. Yeah. It was just crazy talk, Romania, are you kidding me? And having all this kind of happen. But that is what you grew up in and marinated in, like it's a normal thing to have the euro, it's a normal thing to have this kind of hyper integration. How do you consider yourself as a person? I mean, are you European? What is your own identity and kind of loyalties? If you don't mind me asking a personal question.
Sure. I'm glad to answer, but I'm not sure my answers would be representative of my generation.
Sure. Yeah, whatever.
I definitely see myself as French first and European second, and I think that the European project, it was and still is in many ways one of the most important and successful human endeavors in all of history.
Explain that for a bit, because I think Americans don't understand, or they quickly dismiss that as a concept. It's something that I tend to agree with, but explain that from your perspective.
From the very simple thing from my perspective, you talk about it being hard to imagine that people could go to Warsaw to have beers and pay in the same currency. The really hard part to imagine is that in my family, all of the men above a certain age fought in wars. If you talk about the generation above my grandparents, all of the men who were brothers, the great brother fought in World War I, the second brother fought in World War II and was then in the French Resistance, and the younger brother fought in the war in Indochina. We are literally my generation is, I guess, the second generation for the first time since the fall of the Roman Empire to have not known war on a massive scale. And that is an incredible human accomplishment. I mean, when you think about it for just a second, it is an incredible human accomplishment. And so just that, I mean, people forget that, but just that by itself is an enormous accomplishment. Europe was the most war-torn continent in history, permanently, always. Every single generation had a war, up to the point where Europe created the worst war in history, right? And dragged the entire world into it. Twice. And we created this sort of institutional framework whereby binding countries together economically and to a certain extent culturally, we reach the level where war is not only unlikely but unthinkable. I mean, I don't want to jinx it by saying it's unthinkable. Who knows? We might see the Bundeswehr in Athens, a month from now. But that by itself is, I think, an enormous accomplishment. And the second part of that accomplishment, sort of the corollary, is the fact that for the most part, except for like Belarus, Europe is democratic. If you look, you said yourself, remembering Eastern Europe in the 90s, if you've taken bets on how many Eastern European countries would be, democratic and prosperous 15 years hence, most people would not have bet on that outcome. Most people would not have bet that, you mentioned Romania. Romania has tons of corruption, at least for Europe. But it's a democratic country where people are pretty rich, and 18-year-olds don't have to be pressed into service to shoot other 18-year-olds. And that is, on the scale of human history, that is an enormous accomplishment. And so, that's why when I say the European construction is one of the most amazing human endeavors in history, I sort of mean it in that sort of deep and profound way. Not that what I'm saying is deep and profound. The accomplishment is deep and profound.
I tend to agree with you very strongly for the same reasons, and this is why I'm kind of lonely. I think sort of Euro enthusiast. I think I wrote a piece like 5 years ago, something about 2 cheers for the Euro, or something along those lines, for reasons of integration and not having war, and having a kind of peace and prosperity and a freedom of movement in a way which is stunning, and again, totally unthinkable in the context of looking back 20 years and certainly 30, and perhaps even 10. I mean, what's happened in the Baltic states is
incredible.
There were Soviet tanks in Vilnius in 1991 crushing people, and now they've had somewhat of an economic setback, as everyone else has, but they're generally very prosperous. And mostly democratic countries, and I think that is a wonderful thing. And then the question becomes, I analogize Europe and the kind of the Euro and the European integration process with things like the World Trade Organization, which is to say, it's bureaucratized, it's inherently anti-democratic. If you just use the definitions of the word, it is a centralized bureaucracy like beyond the reach, for the most part, of political wills of human beings and nation states, this kind of stuff. So there's an inherent flaw in it, and at the same time, it is preferable probably to the outcomes otherwise, or at least it has produced these great things. Free trade is a great thing from my perspective. That plus immigration basically are the two greatest engines of prosperity. And so you can stomach, or I can stomach, some people can't, the anti-democratic, kind of just sort of heavily bureaucratized mechanisms to produce mostly free trade or lower trade barriers globally, because it produces these great benefits. Europe is the same way, but I've always been haunted by the fact that it really is anti-democratic. It really is. There isn't a really great track record of super genius centralized bureaucrats doing wonderful things for the little people who have no effect on how they make their decisions. That's kind of a bad place to be. And my worry, in addition to anything else, is just that what's happening right now in Europe is that those bills are coming due in Greece. Greece, which I think it's safe to say really should have never been in the euro. It's pretty obvious to anyone who's been in Greece who's looked at the way that simple things like they collect tax receipts. I mean, it's not a country that was harmonized. They made incredible strides, and the lure of European integration really did change a lot of behaviors.
That's how it works.
In a mostly good way, I think. But at the same time, that was just a huge transformation that was being asked of them. And I just worry then what happens next? What is the alternative scenario when these kind of anti-democratic problems inevitably rear up? And I don't know. I mean, that's kind of why I was asking about the alternative scenarios. What happens next? And maybe it is an inevitable kind of muddling through. But again, we're going to see a headline 2 weeks from now, which is going to be a new agreement comes to bear, and at some point you're just going to run out of money. There's not, someone's going to need to bail out the ECB, and when that happens, then we're going to be in some pretty awkward territory. And I realize it's not a question to throw to you, but I'm just going to throw it to you anyway.
Yeah, that's so. With regard to the sort of technocratic and anti-democratic aspect of the EU, I completely agree. And I mean, the sort of way I look at it is that it's been a victim of its own success. I mean, in a sense, it's like a character in a Greek tragedy. It has all these wonderful gifts and all this wonderful stuff, and as a consequence of that, because of its hubris, the downfall is all the steepest. I tend personally, and this is not a view shared by many of my compatriots even today, I tend personally to take a sort of mostly British view of Europe, which is that all of the economic stuff, all of the integration, free trade, opening the borders, free movement of capital, goods, and people, awesome. Political integration, no thank you.
Why?
Because it's not democratic. Like, if people in France think they're French and they want to vote for our French government to represent French interests, and people in Germany likewise, and people in Italy likewise, and that's just the way it is. And willing things into existence does not make them happen, no matter how hard you want it to happen. And that's something that Eurocrats, even though it's a loaded term, it's Europhiles, Euro elites, all these loaded terms, but which sort of describes a real group of people, just don't realize that. And so this is why we had the euro, because even though the facts said that the project was doomed, the facts had to be damned because we had to build, and you can either make a cynical case, which is that, and I sort of don't want to sound like a conspiracy monger, but Europe has always been built through crisis, and so in the back of some of people's minds was the idea, maybe the euro will have some problems, but it'll be the opportunity to build even more Europe. But it's not working.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit, it's always bizarre to view American politics from within America, let alone Washington, D.C., where I'm sitting right now. But it's certainly bizarre to look at it from the continent of Europe. What is sort of your or stand-in for the entire nation of France perspective on the insanity of our presidential contest right now?
Oh boy. So it's sort of interesting because I do follow U.S. politics, and it's always interesting to contrast how U.S. politics happens and how it's viewed in Europe, especially France. And sort of every 4 years, the question on everybody's lips is, are those fat, stupid Americans going to elect the nice, reasonable Democrat, or are they going to elect the mean, insane Republican? And, with every passing cycle, the Republican guy has grown more mean and more insane. At least from one perspective. So that's sort of the view from Europe. I still remember sort of people sort of back in 2004 my friends who sort of grabbed me by the lapel and said, you follow U.S. politics. Tell me they're not going to vote for Bush. Tell me they're not going to vote for Bush. So that's basically, I mean, the way it's viewed. The sort of striking thing at a sort of high level is the institutional incapacity of the Republican Party to promote a person who looks remotely like a plausible president, because there isn't any running, and so it's worrisome to see any country where the two sort of main parties, one of them seems to be constitutionally incapable of producing credible governing people, and it's. I remembered recently there was a cover in The Economist when in the last cycle the candidates had been nominated. The Economist had a cover with Obama and McCain saying, and the title was "America at its best."
Sorry.
The idea being that it had promoted people who represented sort of everything that non-Americans want to like about America. So Barack Obama, who's young and charismatic and black and all the rest, and John McCain, who had sort of, at least in the mythos, built his career on sort of straight talking and being a maverick and being a war hero, and it was sort of this picture of a political process which is unique and which is easily decried or mocked or reviled from outside, producing an outcome that, even though you might find plenty to quibble with the candidates, it was at least hard not to argue that they had produced people who were candidates who were sort of up to the job. And we'll still have Obama, who's obviously up to the job of president, and the Republican side is sort of behaving like the EU in Greece, in the throes of a total institutional failure, and it's striking and scary.
A couple things on that.
That's my rant.
It's a good one, and I think illustrative in many ways. Your sort of take on on how the French approach review presidential politics is, let's say, it resonates with my experience. I will never forget being in, I believe it was Lyon, where my wife is from, in January 2001 or perhaps January 2002. That Christmas, Bush had been elected, and there was a protest of people who were outraged that George W. Bush, this American president, was in favor of the death penalty. Did you know that? He's in favor of the death penalty? And not only that, he's not going to sign the Kyoto Protocol. What a monster! It just said to me a lot
I've had people explain to me that the U.S. is not a democracy because it has the death penalty.
Yeah, I mean, I totally despise the death penalty, so I agree with the sentiment, but on some level. But Bill Clinton was executing retarded teenagers on purpose to make political points. There's a level of kind of anti-sophistication or just naivete about what actually happens, or what these people actually believe. I'm sure that the common French view would be that Barack Obama, for instance, is like pro-gay marriage, which he totally is not. He just is not. They ask him about it all the time, and he says no. There's probably the belief, and this is a belief that is shared by a lot of American liberals, although they're, I think, slowly coming to their senses about it. There's a belief that he's not really, he's not locking up all these minorities for drug war, drug offenses and stuff. He's doing that even much worse than George W. Bush is. But there's just this feeling that since he is sympathetic on some level, that he must be good about these things that we care about, even though he totally is not. And it's a source of constant, let's say, amusement for me to sort of to see that view of things. I think you mentioned that Republicans don't have any kind of plausible candidate. I think they have a plausible candidate, although I don't think they'll win, and I don't like him at all. But Mitt Romney, I mean, he has thrown up his whole kind of value proposition is that he can look plausible. He's very similar, I believe, to John Kerry in that regard.
Photographically, he looks plausible.
Photographically, he looks plausible.
I don't remember who had the line that was, Mitt Romney is the guy who you'd cast as a president in a made-for-TV movie.
Right, exactly. That's a way of looking at it. And his candidacy is basically trying to reflect, refract, repackage, most importantly, what are modern kind of Republican notions of governance, which is to say it's completely incoherent. It lacks any sort of through-line narrative or a set of ideologies. He's just sort of saying, I'm going to tinker around the edges here and resell you something that will be plausible to the American people. I don't think it's going to work. I think he will win the nomination most likely, although he's hit all kinds of rough patches. But it is astonishing, just astonishing, that with the most favorable possible electoral advantages you can imagine. First of all, people who identify themselves as conservatives outnumber people who identify themselves as liberal like 2 to 1 in this country. It's 40% to 20%, give or take. So you have that built in. You have a lousy economy that has undershot every projection for it.
Yeah. It's recovering now, but
it's improving now, but it's not good at all. We still have a labor force participation rate that we haven't seen since the horrible recession of 78 to 82. It's just been terrible. I think Barack Obama has been a profound disappointment on a lot of levels. Two things that liberals and progressives hold dear, let alone libertarians. So you have this incredible opportunity to run. I mean, you should be able to walk to victory in this circumstance, and yet Republicans are losing market share. They've lost 800,000 voter registrations since 2008.
Oh, interesting.
Democrats have lost more. They've deserved it more. But the long trend right now is people are just not buying what Republicans are selling. And this is even in an atmosphere where you do have very identifiable kind of populist uprisings or grassroots uprisings about things like government spending and the size and scope of government in the form of Tea Party. So you have a demonstrated kind of, hey, we'd like you to go that direction, please, from the Republicans' grassroots, and they can't produce a candidate who reflects that. They're scared of that. They are so institutionally oriented towards just kind of managing upward the growth of government. With the exception of Ron Paul, no one is walking up to the mic and saying, we don't need a Department of Commerce. Why do we have one? No one is talking like that, which, Democrats used to talk like that in the 1970s. It is, in theory, like from the liberal democratic kind of mind point of view, Republicans are these monsters who want to rebut government. But from my point of view, as someone who actually wants to do that, they're not. There is very little talk. The only thing they'll talk about is they'll say, we need a balanced budget amendment so that we can force ourselves to do something that we have absolutely no set of policies to enact. It's remarkable how Republicans have screwed this up and have not provided a coherent alternative to what's gone on now. And it couldn't have happened to a more deserving bunch, frankly. I mean, there are very few policies that you can point your finger at. If you hate Barack Obama's policies, then you're going to have to confront the fact that George W. Bush installed set the ball rolling on a majority of them. If you hate the bailouts, then you hate Republicans. If you hate the stimulus, you hate Republicans. On some level, Republicans aren't going to be able to go to the next step until they really deal with their own culpability in the absolute mismanagement of the country over the last 10 years. And again, I haven't set you up with a question there, but that's what we're going to have to do.
Yeah, no, but I agree. I mean, I would sort of caveat that by saying, by pointing out that actually the Republicans have put forward some Medicare reform proposals that are actually, compared to what's politically sort of feasible, they're actually quite ambitious. And the real problem in the growth of the size of the government in the U.S. is healthcare. So there are inklings of a seriousness. There are sort of flashes of seriousness, but generally, at both the policy level and at the sort of personal level, meaning who gets promoted, it's a disaster.
Well, let's end on that super apocalyptic note.
Super optimistic note. So yeah,
I mean the way I look at it is
basically established that both the U.S. and Europe are a disaster. So
are totally doomed.
But
no, it's a weird place for me.
Go and buy some stuff, and because we need you to, otherwise the economy is going to get even worse.
The moral of the story is that everybody should try to move to Switzerland while there's still time. Although Switzerland screwed it up. I'm looking at you, Switzerland, right now, because they pegged their currency to the euro of all things. They panicked, which is sad.
They pegged it because it was driven incredibly high.
Yeah, of course, because they actually
they didn't actually peg it. They set a floor. A ceiling. And it's sort of pushing against the ceiling.
Of course, and it's a great sadness for those of us. Cheers for
not if you're going shopping there.
That's true. We should not.
I mean, my wife is Swiss, so that's a real problem for me.
Is she the Genevoise, or is she some kind of a Zurich
she's from St. Gallen.
So that makes her a what crazy dialect does she speak?
She's from the German-speaking side of the country.
Right, but is it the Bernese dialect or the Zurich dialect? I'm fascinated.
Oh, you're
you don't know.
She's the Swiss one. I'm the arrogant French guy who considers that. I'm the arrogant Parisian. I'm sorry, who considers that everything beyond the périphérique is barbaric. So
that's true.
I have no idea. I just know it's German.
My wife's brother is married to a Bernese, a Swiss, and I'm mispronouncing everything at this point. But he studied. He speaks medieval German.
Okay.
And
yeah.
other
Swiss German is really weird. It's right up against Austria. That's how much I know.
Right. Well, 2 cheers for Switzerland, and 3 cheers. They get the whole thing.
Yeah.
The most important thing is that they all speak to each other in English.
Right.
From my point of view, the Swiss soccer team speaks to each other in English. And
interesting. I didn't know that.
What are they going to do? I mean, it's not like the French are going to learn German. For crying out loud.
Yeah.
You know that. Okay, well, it's been great talking to you, and hopefully this whole, I'm in a profoundly uncomfortable position to the effect that it's all kind of pessimistic, right? So like the euro is going to crash, and the U.S. is the last too big to fail
eating itself.
Things. So I'm questioning my premises, because the the general orientation, I think, of libertarianism, and certainly of Californianism, which I'm most guilty of, is towards the great
and reasonable optimism.
Yeah, unreasonable optimism. Life's been pretty good since 1800, and it will continue to get that way. It's just kind of difficult.
Especially to the Swiss.
Especially for the Swiss. True facts, and this is a bizarre thing to end on, so we should. The Swiss, I believe, in the 17th century, burned more witches than anybody else in the country. Or anybody else in the world. They were just
Switzerland was the last place in Europe to give women the vote. The canton in Appenzell gave women the vote in the 70s.
1972.
Yeah.
Switzerland, crazy place. All right, Pascal, thank you. Thanks very much. And talk to you
With
later.
that optimistic segue into obscurantist but rich Switzerland, it was great talking to you.
You too. Goodbye.
Bye.